is where I have funded, I have been funded, and when I have not been funded, because it happens both ways. We'll talk, summarize what we've been talking about, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that you'd like to pose. So without further ado, which direction am I going? Okay, so I am a research scientist at the Center for Applied Research and Evaluation at Wichita State University's Community Engagement Institute. My PhD is in community psych. I graduated from the community psych program at Wichita State. That was after I had already gone to graduate school to be an English teacher and also to be a marketing professional. So I had a couple of different runs at graduate school before something stuck. I've been at the Community Engagement Institute for 7 years. I'm also the former editor of the Global Journal of Community Psychology Practice. And most of my work is centered around innovative data collection, mixed methods type of research, and I'm in all different kinds of domains. So because I'm more method-centered than domain-centered, I have a lot of work in behavioral health, in early childhood. I've worked with adult protective services. I've worked with a bunch of different types of partners with a bunch of different types of funding. And so while I am not a grant writer, there are people out there who do nothing but grant writing. That is their profession and what they get paid for. I do have some varied experience in writing up proposals and grant applications over the course of my time at the Institute. I am a mom. I have 2 pink puppies and 3 fur kids. My fur kids are currently sleeping next to my desk. I apologize in advance if they decide they want to get mouthy. It happens occasionally. I've been married for 22 years, and I prefer caramel over chocolate, in case that's important to anyone. This picture in the center here is one of our more fun pictures of folks that I work with in the Center for Applied Research and Evaluation. We are affectionately known as CARE, and this was Halloween where we dressed up as Care Bears. So when we talk about the types of funding that are available, oh, one more thing. I did want to do this real quick before I get into the meat of things. I feel like it's really important to show up authentically. And so to position myself and how I have approached both my work and my life sort of in general, I think it's important for you to know where I come from. I am clearly a white cisgendered woman. That's my visual phenotypic presentation. I'm in my 40s and I live and work in a small Midwestern city in Kansas, Wichita to be specific for those who know the geography. I work really hard to see intersectionalities in others, but I don't do it perfectly, and I never will, because I'm constantly learning and constantly trying to understand the world around me. But most of my experience is in the position of being a white woman growing up middle class in the middle of the country. So just to make sure that you feel comfortable telling me when my position is being an influence, and I'm happy to receive that feedback as well. Okay, so having said that, this is by no means an exhaustive list of the kinds of ways you can get funding for the work that you'd like to do. They're just the big buckets, right? So there's grants, contracts, and subcontracts. The main differences between these 2 things, grants and contracts, obviously subcontracts is a subset of contracts. Grants and contracts are different in the ways that they are funded. So A grant typically has this, and you may all have different levels of experience. I'm sorry if I'm repeating something you already know, but there's generally a pot of money that has a specific plan, and it is going to be dispersed according to that plan. Grants can come from the government, they can come from foundations, they can come from a bunch of different places, but they generally start with a budget, and they will divvy out the money based on a particular plan or theme. Contracts are a lot more easy to negotiate. That is where a government partner or a nonprofit partner or even a for-profit partner has a need that you might be able to fill. And so there will be a lot more negotiation in terms of deliverables and budget and timing in a contract versus a grant. Grants are much more structured. And of course, subcontracts are basically either you are trying to get work from someone else as a function of a contract that you have signed, or you are that person that's fulfilling a specific role. The way there are different ways to find these different kinds of funding. So in Kansas specifically, there is a website and a email list called Kansas Grant Watch. And it's basically an aggregator for all of the nonprofits and for-profit and government RFPs that go out. And so if you sign up for this email, you get a digest on whatever timing you want. And it says, hey, these funding opportunities have become available. You can then look for more information. That aggregator obviously has a free side and a paid side. And if you pay for additional information, you get additional information. But sometimes there's enough of a nugget there that you can sort of wind your way around to the information that you need. There's lots of different kinds of procurement emails. So many states have specific legislation that defines how procurement of any kind of good or service can occur within that state. There's usually something to do with an open request type of qualification. That's the word I'm looking for. My words are gone. It's after lunch. And as a function of that, sometimes you can sign up for emails that alert you to different requests for proposal. So in Sedgwick County, the county that I live and work in, I am regularly getting emails from the county administrator that says, hey, we need someone to do this work. And 9 times out of 10, it's nothing I have anything to do with. Like, I think the last one I got was about building a database for traffic tickets or something. I mean, it was something that I wouldn't have anything to do with. But there are occasionally times that things come through for, say, our county developmental disability organization. That's definitely work that I would want to be a part of if I can be. So it's good to sign up for a bunch of different types of emails like that. If you have the opportunity to do that, you can always cruise through state websites, but my experience is that generally state websites are not super easy to navigate. So if you can go through the procurement process and understand kind of what the qualifications and criteria are, that's helpful. There's also a lot of email lists and newsletters associated with nonprofits, depending on the domain in which you prefer to work. So, for example, I am really interested in criminal justice work. I don't get to work in it a lot, but because I'm interested in that, I can sign up for the National Institute of Justice email, and they send me information about their most recent funding opportunity. Or a program that needs evaluation or that sort of thing. And so depending on the domain in which you operate or your research operates in, you can look at the nonprofits and the federal agencies that are associated with that domain and sign up for emails to get information about what sort of funding opportunities are available. SAMHSA is another one. I'm going to get it wrong. Mental health. I can't ever remember all of the different letters. It's SAMHSA. And it's part of the Health and Human Services Division of the federal government. And they have ridiculous amounts of funding opportunities on their website that you can just sort of pick through. And we'll talk a little bit about, you know, some of the things to consider as we're looking at that. You can also set up Google alerts if you have a set of search words that are part of your research or part of your work. You can always, you know, add funding opportunity to the end of those search terms and set up a Google alert so that you get an email anytime a hit comes through that's relevant. And then obviously, you know, networking in meetings like this, going to conferences or being a part of the community. There's always the word of mouth, either from past work that you've done or from, you know, potentially something someone else is doing. You could say, oh, well, you know, I'm an expert in X, Y, and Z, or I have experience in X, Y, and Z. Do you need, you know, help with that as a subcontractor? There's a lot of different ways to get those types of funding. All right. Oops, wrong direction. I'm going to be forever moving in the wrong direction, I'm sure. So there are a lot of things that tend to be hidden inside of these requests that you need to keep aware of. When we go through the cases, I'll point out some of these things specifically. But for example, the National Institutes of Health have varying sizes of grants that you can apply for. What they don't tell you is that if you haven't published in the area that you're trying to get a grant for, the odds that you're going to get that grant are almost nothing. So in that particular case, you would need to either partner, have a co-PI, a co-principal investigator with someone who has published in that area, or you know, you would need to have a base of publishing to be able to apply for those grants. It's kind of like, I feel like the publishing requirements, they'll never tell you that you're required to publish in order to get this. But those types of requirements, or having relevant work, right, that shows that you can do this type of thing, it's kind of like building credit, which is a horrible system in and of itself. I'm not endorsing that, but the process is similar in that you either have to partner with people who have certain credentials in order to be able to be considered a serious applicant, or you have to start small and then build on top over time, either publishing or specific types of evaluation or credibility that then is applied to the way that you propose the work that you're going to do. Other buzzwords and trigger words, be cautious of things like data management. Depending on the type of work that is being requested, you may need HIPAA compliant machines, storage. You might need HIPAA-based human subjects training. So when they say data management, it's a good idea to look a little bit deeper, depending on what you're being asked to do. In most cases, especially with grants, you can look up and see, if not the application, some sort of work product for people who have gotten that award before. So, for example, one of the cases that I'll talk about in a second, there are previous applicants' materials that are available to see who was funded in the last round and how did they go about doing those things and what did they say they were going to do and how did that work out. So it's a good idea that if you are going to go for something, especially on the federal level, to see if they have published who or what kinds of projects have been funded before. There's also, in some cases, and this is sort of a, it goes with the buzzword trigger words in addition to sort of project pieces, but sometimes they say things like, you need a letter of commitment from partners before we can move forward with your application. And the implication of that is you should have some partners. You shouldn't be doing this by yourself. And so if that's the case, then you really kind of need to look at the different kinds of partners that might be involved. So for example, there was a recent Robert Wood Johnson Foundation request for proposal. And I know Dr. Vernita, you were aware of the policy around wage gap, right? Well, because that was so community-based, they said, let us know who you might be working with. But the actual implication of that is you shouldn't be doing this work without commitments from the communities in which you're going to be going into. And so if you don't have those letters of commitment, then that expected partnership may not be given the weight that it should have. So that's something to consider as well. Other things, in certain cases, there will be a specific email or a specific contact person that you can submit questions to. Most of the time, there will be a deadline for those questions, like you have to ask by a certain date, and then they will answer all of the questions all at once, and you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. So make sure that you understand what that question process looks like, or if there's a webinar, sometimes, especially the large federal ones and the large foundations will provide a webinar to talk about what they want to do. The problem with those webinars is that often it's just someone reading the RFP. There's not a lot of additional data as far as my experience has been. They won't answer a lot of questions live when it comes to those webinars. So it's usually a good idea to talk, to go to those if you have the time and the schedule works, but it's not a deal breaker if you don't get that far. Some of them will have a pre-application screening process, meaning you have to write a letter of intent first. If you write a letter of intent, there will be specific requirements. Typically, it's not just, yeah, I intend to apply. It's going to be, a shorter, smaller, less specific version of what you intend to put in your proposal. But it is an added layer, so you have to get through that screening process before you ever write a full proposal. So it's important to understand if that screening process is in place and what the criteria are for getting past that screening process. Do you need letters of support or commitment? Often, if you're going to use partners, those letters are really important. Sometimes before you even get into the work, you have to have your IRB and your instruments already picked out. That can be really challenging if you don't know what the intervention is. That's the last question on this slide. If you are working with a partner who is doing an intervention, is that intervention ready and specified? Does it have a logic model that you can actually work with to understand how you might want to evaluate that work? There's a lot going into those proposals and applications that has to be done at the front end before you ever even get the funding or the work. And that's the hardest part, I think, about getting and applying and getting funding is there's a lot of hours that you're not paid to get to the work where you get paid. And the more you can put into that is usually the better. But that also means that that's time and effort and energy that might not ultimately be rewarded. And then I'll show you an example of a human subjects section. A lot of federal grants require you to fill out basically this very specific human subjects. How are you going to treat your human subjects in this particular project or evaluation, and it can be very lengthy and it can be very painful. So just keep in mind that saying you're going to do things above board and very ethically, and that you have, say, CITI training or what have you, may not be enough. Okay. So our first case is one that I applied for in 2017. It was for a local nonprofit group. They operate in Kansas and Oklahoma. I don't know that they operate in other states, maybe Nebraska, but they're very regional. It's a specific program called Seatbelts Are for Everyone. It was targeted at high school kids to make them wear their seatbelts more often. It was a request for proposal process. We had done previous work with this particular nonprofit, and so therefore got word that they had this project coming down the pike. And so that's how we found out about it. And we were ultimately funded. I will show you what the RFP looks like. So it's a typical RFP in the sense that it has all of the basic elements, but here are some of the things that really got our attention as we were reading through it. So in the very first part, they have a little bit of a contradiction. Research to be published and available, progress towards having published research. We addressed this with the organization, not only in our proposal, but also in our presentation. So in this particular case, there was 2 steps. There was the proposal step, and then if you got through the proposal step, you got a presentation opportunity to actually talk to the board and present your project. This was intended to be completed in one 12-month period. That was the timeline they had set out, and they wanted published work. Now, as an editor for a journal, I was able to say, that's not going to happen. There is 0 chance that we can do this research that you've asked us to do in a 12-month period and get it published in that 12-month period. It's not happening. That's not going to work. And so we had to have a little bit of a negotiation with them. And because it was a contract, we could do that. One of the other things that I wanted to point out on this one. Okay, so here's a trigger word. Retroactive review, which means they think they've got some data that they want you to use, but you don't know what that data is. So there can be times where they will say, you know, don't tell me how much it's going to cost for me to collect this, and this, when we've got data that's already available. If you don't have the chance to be able to really understand what that data looks like, that can be something that comes back to bite you on the back end of completing that contract. So in an RFP, it's a good idea to make sure that if they want you to work with existing data, even if it's just census data, that has its own tips and tricks that are associated with it. It's a good idea to make sure that you have a handle on what that actually looks like. In this particular case, the data was a hot freaking mess and it was awful. And so we had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what that looked like. I don't know that there was anything else. Capacity and capability. One of the things, you're always going to be keeping your CVs up to date, but having your full CV associated with any particular RFP is sometimes not helpful. So it's a good idea to weed through it and make sure that really the most relevant pieces are there. If you've got a, 10-page CV, it's not going to get the kind of attention that you might want it to. And then, qualifications and experience having to do with past work. Again, it's like credit. So you might have to build some of that up or partner with somebody else in order to get everything that you want out of that. I don't think there was anything else. Price, this was the negotiation piece. They had very specific ideas about how we should be billing and processing that. This was their description of the existing data, and even this was not enough information. It was really rough. So, and then, yeah, then there was the submission process and all of that. So what we ultimately ended up proposing for this particular work was, we'll look at your data, but we're not going to highlight most of that. What we're going to do is we're going to create data instruments. We're going to do a quasi-experimental data collection experiment to see if kids are actually using their seatbelts more. And it was a very detailed description of how that quasi-experimental piece was going to work, because that was the big chunk of what we wanted to do. We did end up getting published, but it wasn't until 2019. So a full year after the contract had finished. So we were able to tell them in that proposal that that was about as soon as you could hope for it to happen. So that was the first case. The second one, which if we look here, was not funded. Oh, darn. This was a SAMHSA grant this was a weird one, actually. So the applicant had to be a state agency, and we were working with that state agency to apply for this grant. So it was a SAMHSA grant, and it would have ultimately been awarded to the state of Kansas, but we were an integral part of what that application process looked like. It came through as a NFO, I said, notice of funding opportunity, but it's also called an FOA, which is a funding opportunity announcement. There's a whole bunch of different acronyms that they like to use to make sure everyone is off their, on their toes, not paying too close attention. This was also an evaluation project, and it was not funded. And this one, so you can see it was 87 pages. And that's not unusual for a federal grant. You don't have to read all 87 pages all at once. There are a couple of places that are really significant. This is where they will tell you, there's exactly this amount of money that's designated by Congress. That's not going to change. You're not going to be able to negotiate any of that. They're going to make this number of awards, and depending on the kind of application you have, you can get up to this amount of money. Oops, wrong way. I'm going to always be going the wrong way. So they describe the purpose of what's going on. In this case, I think the biggest concern was they had very specific things they wanted to be delivered, and our state was not willing to check all those boxes. They wanted to do things the way that they wanted to do things. And that was a big problem in trying to get funded for the work. So for example, there was, I think, mobile crisis having to do with this 24-hour emergency services work. There was a bunch of other pieces of what the government said they wanted to have accomplished with this money that our state just flat out wouldn't write into the application. And that was a big function of us not being able to be funded. The data collection and performance measurement. Some of the grants will tell you that, here's the data you need to collect. And it sounds a little bit in the FOA that this is all you need to do. But this is really just the tracking information, the outputs that they require you to track. It's not the evaluation itself. In this particular case, we also had to have an evaluation plan. We had to have a set of instruments that were validated through publication. We had to have a human subject section. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. So when it seems fairly simple to do this data collection, because it's not even a page, right? Like it's maybe a page when you get to the end of it. It seems really simple, and that's actually not the case. There's more information. Okay, the other piece that can sneak in is this idea of cost sharing and match. Most of the time, if you're applying as an individual, it won't be an issue. But if you happen to be applying as part of an institution, you need to know what your institution can handle in terms of match. And that's basically you're shoveling in a certain percentage of money in addition to what they're funding you to do. So that can come in the form of salaries. It can come in the form of overhead and equipment. It kind of depends on the organization that you're a part of. But if your organization can't do a 50% match or a 33% match, then that's not going, it doesn't matter if you're funded or not, you can't do that work because you won't be able to make the match. The other part of that sometimes gets hidden is if you are an individual, if you're an individual, it usually doesn't matter. If you're part of an organization, then there can often be caps or limitations on the percentage of indirect income you can spend or collect. So for example, our indirect rate, which is what covers all of our other operating expenses. It covers travel, it covers professional development, it covers equipment, all of that stuff. We have a particular rate that's built into our lab rate. But when we partner with government agencies, oftentimes that's cut in half, and we can only submit a budget that is utilizing that much smaller percentage of indirects. It's like I said, it's generally not an issue if you're applying as an individual, but there's, limits in the number of individuals who can actually do some of this work. So it's a good idea to keep in mind what those indirect limitations might be. And then I think the only other thing I wanted to show you was that human subjects piece, which is, let's see. Nope. I think it was Appendix C. Was it C? Oh no, here we go. Okay, Appendix C. Participant human subjects. So this is a section that we had to complete, and it takes a really long time. You have to go through and answer every single question, and this is not even the beginning of what it looks like. I think our human subjects appendix was 10 pages, something like that. And it's all the normal stuff you would have to do with an IRB. It's all confidentiality. How are you going to do incentives if you're going to do them? How are you going to do consent? How are you going to make sure they're not coerced? All of that stuff that you would go through an IRB application with, you have to do in triplicate when it comes to some of these human subject sections. So it's important to know that, make sure you've got the time. Like if you find this, the week before and you're like, yeah, sure, let's go do that application, it could take a lot more time than you think it's going to take. I also just wanted to point out that one of the reasons we weren't funded for this particular project, and like I said, a big function of that was just our state's inability to provide some of the mandatory things they wanted to provide, was there's a very strict expectation, where am I going here, of how it's supposed to look. They'll tell you everything from, I can't find it off the top of my head, and I don't want to take too much time with that. They'll tell you everything from the type of font you can use, to how many characters it can be, to the margins and what they expect in terms of tables. And the whole point of all of those very specific, and it happens in RFPs too, is they're trying to make an apples to apples comparison. So if I submit an application and Dr. Vernita submits an application, they don't have to wade through a bunch of formatting differences or flashy type or different kinds of graphics to get to the meat of what we say we're going to do. It's all in the same format for everything. So it's important to really focus on making the content as concise and as compelling as you can make it, because you're not going to be able to use visuals in the same way that you would say a proposal for a for-profit. In that case, a lot of times flash and bang and pretty fonts and all of that is really helpful. But in a lot of contracts or a lot of grants, it's just not a possibility. So very general conclusions, right? Make sure you're doing your homework on both who's giving the money out and on the type of project that they're doing. Make sure that if they have those sort of hidden requirements that they're not saying they need, that you find a way to be able to really understand who they're funding and how they're funding those projects. If you have partners, and I can't, honestly, the SAFE, the Seat Belts Are For Everyone project was one of the very few that I've worked on where we didn't have external partners. We almost always have partners, either because we are in communities where we need those trusted individuals, or because we need the credibility of a particular institution or what have you. So if you're going to have those partners, make sure that you've talked to them. If you don't need a letter of commitment, make sure you at least have an email that says you gave them a heads up and said you were going to work with them. Be very transparent in how you want to do that. You should do as much of the planning for the work you are proposing as possible. That takes extra time. There's obviously a balance of how much time do I do that I'm not paid for to get a job that I will be paid for? And there's no one right answer to that. But the more you're able to have a complete package that's ready to go, the less you have to do when you find, the less panic there is when they're like, okay, we're going to give you the money. And then you have to go, wait, what did we say we would do? What was that again? And I've had that moment before. So it's not fun to have the funding actually come through and then have to try and scramble and figure out how you're going to get it done. So that's really a big function of that planning. And then, factor what you're doing now into what might come later. And that has, that's everything from partners to interventions to instruments to IRB, factor in now. If you know for a fact it takes your IRB 2 months to get through an application, make sure that you're doing that prep work ahead of time so that that doesn't put you behind if and when you get funded. I will say that there is no hard and fast rule about how to do all of this. You have, people with varying degrees of experience in grant writing and proposal writing, and it's a very much learning curve type of situation. So take my advice with, whatever boulders of salt you have with other people in different types of expertise. But I'm happy to entertain questions. Please just let me know how I can be helpful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friend, for that. We're going to go ahead and do Q&A. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we'll open for questions